I kind of got my ducks in a wrong row again.
Okay.
So, Dan Christensen got you all together to come here, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So, and Dan couldn't be here today? Is that correct? Someplace, his brother is here, I believe. But anyway, we appreciate all the work that everybody's done. Doris, don't go too far. Stand up, and then Tanya, you guys have really worked hard to put this together. I don't see where Tanya went. Oh, so we want to thank you guys for doing all this, okay? Any other, there is a calendar laying there. If any of you folks would like to volunteer to be at the museum sometimes, it's, Doris, tell the dates.
Monday until the 31st of August.
Right.
Monday, Wednesday, or Friday from 1 to 4.
And some Sundays, if you want to come on Sunday.
No, we're closed on Sunday unless they want to pick up, but no. Monday,
They
Wednesday,
can call.
Yeah, you can always call.
Phone numbers on the door.
Yes.
If somebody wants to visit, yeah.
Yeah, because we got lots of kind of neat things in there to see, and we always get other things too. And there's a room for each town in the county, right? Okay, now I can start. Walt Miller. He's a historian with the Hastings Navy Ammunition Depot for 25 years.
Yes.
And you don't look a day over 50.
Right. You ought to see it from my side.
Or when you look, never mind, I was going to say when you look in the mirror, but I won't say that. Okay, so we appreciate you coming today.
Sure.
And sharing all your information with us.
Okay, thank
Okay?
you.
And I won't say another thing.
All right.
Maybe.
All right. My name is Walt Miller. My interest in the Naval Ammunition Depot is I'm a retired architect, and there's still 2,200 buildings out there, 65 factory buildings. That facility produced 40% of all of our World War II Navy ammunition, and at its peak it was employing 11,000 people. That was in Hastings, Nebraska, just 30 miles east of here. And it was in operation for 24 years. There's 300 miles of roads out there, 200 miles of railroad tracks, 65 factory buildings. And it's still all in place after 75 years. And so as a retired architect, that's my interest. I also ride a bicycle, and I used to love to go out on Sunday afternoons and when the jackrabbits were out there and the pheasants, and they wouldn't even flush. But I sneaked into all of the factory buildings to look around and figure out how they worked. I was a sergeant in the Marine Corps, spent a lot of time on board Navy ships, so that Navy base was just like a home base for me. It took 250 Marines to do security guard duty on this Naval Ammunition Depot at Hastings. And I taught for several years at the Central Community College, and this is at the entrance to Central Community College, which used to be the headquarters area for the Naval Ammunition Depot. And I did a book several years ago that's available here, and also a DVD for anybody that, if you don't by the end of this, want to know more than you want to. And on the back wall back there are 3 maps, and I would encourage you to at least stop and take a look. One of them is all of the military facilities in Nebraska in World War II. The middle one is the Naval Ammunition Depot that covers 76 square miles, and they kicked 232 farm families off their farms for that. And the big one over there shows all of the buildings that are still out there today. And with that, Dave, I think we'll be ready to start.
World War II was the most terrible conflict of ideas in human history. Before it was over, more than 60 million people had been killed. For 4 long years, the United States was embroiled in that war, and it affected the lives of every man, woman, and child on a daily basis. It united this nation like nothing ever has before. Before it was over, we had 17 million men in uniform to fight in foreign countries. Food, shelter, clothing, and manufactured goods were rationed to the citizens of this country who were working themselves to near exhaustion to provide the war materials needed. It was because of that war that a gigantic naval ammunition depot was built near Hastings, Nebraska, about 2 miles east on Highway 6. This was the main entrance for over 40 years, which many people can still remember. In the 1930s, prior to World War II, this is what the entrance to Hastings looked like on West Highway 6. In the background, the trees are in Lincoln Park. People parked there and slept overnight on their way across the country, because in the 30s decade, prior to World War II, the entire nation was in an economic depression, and the Midwest was in a devastating drought at the same time. The topsoil blew like a black blizzard, creating dust drifts. For nearly 10 years, there were almost no farm crops in Clay and Adams counties. This is what a cornfield looked like back then. This was devastation to this agricultural area. Adams County had 40% unemployment. 10% of the people moved away. Hastings was becoming a ghost town, even though it was the 3rd largest city in the state. It was a hopeless time to live in this part of the country. Then on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked our Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. With 423 planes from 6 aircraft carriers, they sunk 18 of our ships, including 8 major battleships. The next day, the United States declared war on Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. Suddenly, an America that had wanted to remain neutral was united into the greatest industrial empire in history to create war weapons and armies to fight in foreign countries to keep them away from our soil. Military installations were popping up like mushrooms all over Nebraska. There were 12 Army Air Corps fields built. Over at Harvard, they trained 26 squadrons of B-17, B-24, and B-29 bomber crews. Out at Alliance, they trained 15,000 paratroopers and glider pilots. The skies were filled with big, heavy airplanes training for combat abroad. The Martin Bomber Plant in Omaha built 2,600 planes, including the B-29 Enola Gay that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. There were prisoner of war camps located at Fort Robinson, Scotts Bluff, Indianola, and the Atlantic Camp near Holdridge, where over 100,000 prisoners of war were processed. There were 3 Army ammunition plants, one at Sydney, the Cornhusker plant at Grand Island, and the Meade bomb plant. And finally, the huge naval ammunition depot at Hastings, Nebraska. The economic influx of all this military activity pulled Nebraska out of the doldrums of drought and depression of the 1930s. Otherwise, we might look more like Wyoming than the Nebraska that we know today. We were suddenly fighting a 2-ocean war across the Pacific to Japan and across the Atlantic to Europe. This required 2 huge naval fleets, and the Navy brass decided that they wanted a centrally located naval ammunition plant that could produce ammunition for both fleets. They chose the location at Hastings, Nebraska, over 1,000 miles from the nearest ocean, but only 2 days by railroad to either coast. The transcontinental highways 6 and 281 crossed in Hastings. Also 3 railroads cross here. The Union Pacific to the west coast, the Burlington to the east coast, and the Missouri Pacific to the Gulf of Mexico. Nebraska's astronaut Clayton Anderson says you can see the huge naval ammunition depot from outer space. Today it's mostly grassland, contrasted by surrounding irrigated cornfields. In order to acquire the 76 square miles of land for this base, it was condemned by the government and taken away from 232 property owners. Many were evicted in 2 weeks after notification. The perimeter runs 13 miles along Highway 6, 10 miles south to Fairfield and follows the Union Pacific tracks back to the northwest. The function of this facility required 2,200 buildings in clusters over the 76 square miles of land. America already had 2 naval ammunition depots, one at Hawthorne, Nevada for the Pacific Fleet, one at Crane, Indiana for the Atlantic Fleet. Most of the Hastings NAD buildings would be duplicates of these existing structures. The vaults were limited to 500,000 pounds of explosives and spaced about 500 foot apart to avoid a chain reaction in case of an accidental explosion. This is why so much land was required. There were 65 factory buildings at Hastings NAD for the loading and assembly of ammunition. Over 200 warehouses were needed to store unloaded explosive ammunition components and shipping materials. Over 1,900 explosive storage vaults were required to hold the bulk explosives coming in and the loaded ammunition to be shipped out. The Maximum Construction Company of Dayton, Ohio built the NAD. They put up this temporary structure 4 miles east on Highway 6 to oversee the project. They employed over 5,000 construction workers, about the same size crew that built Hoover Dam, and they poured more concrete here. The construction workers came from all over the country and lived in tents like these. Dilapidated old CCC barracks and over 1,000 mobile homes were pulled in. Most of these men had gone for 10 years with little or no work available, so now they were grateful for every hour they were paid. They worked up to 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. Many of the southern workers had never worn shoes before, and now they were exposed to a brutal Nebraska winter. Up to 8 of these explosive storage bunkers were being poured in a single day. In the wintertime, concrete had to be kept over 40 degrees while curing. So a huge tent had to be built over each unit with coal fires, heaters inside. These were brutal conditions for the construction of this facility. But in 1 year, they had it up and producing ammunition by July 4th, 1943, an absolutely miraculous accomplishment. Once the NAD was in operation, 3,500 civilian factory workers per day were going through this main gate past armed Marine guards. The 40-mile perimeter had a barbed wire security fence and patrol roads for Marines and Jeeps. The 3 factory areas were surrounded by these chain-link, night-lighted fences. These factory fences were also patrolled by Coast Guardmen with police dogs. Every civilian entering the NAD had to wear a photo ID security badge at all times. Nebraska had a population of only 1.3 million people and ended up with 140,000 men in uniform before the war was over. 1 out of every 5 men in this state was gone on military duty. As a result, there was a tremendous shortage of workers for physically demanding farm work. Of the 3,500 NAD factory workers, nearly half were women and many were older men. Now they could earn 74 cents an hour, 3 times the going rate for jobs in this area. Factory work areas were very dangerous. It was like working in a fireworks factory. The whole place could explode at any second. The air was full of explosive fumes. Workers had to keep their hair covered at all times and were not allowed to comb it because of the static electricity sparks that might cause an explosion. Because of the tremendous shortage of civilian employees, a battalion of 1,600 black sailors were sent to the NAD for the duration of the war. These young men between the ages of 18 and 25 years of age were from inner cities like Chicago and now found themselves in the rural, barren Midwest that they called Oatmeal, Nebraska. They hated every moment of their time here. In World War II, our military was completely segregated. Black sailors could not serve aboard ships, but only in land-based operations. The population of Hastings in 1942 was 15,000. A year later, it exploded to 23,000, a 50% increase. On the nights the stores were open downtown, the sidewalks were so packed with people, you had to step off into the street to move. The 5-block area on 1st Street from Burlington, Train Depot to Burlington Avenue, were old 2-story brick buildings. Nearly every storefront was rented out for bars and cafes, with gambling rooms in the back and brothels on the 2nd floor to accommodate the military men when they were off duty. There was a tremendous shortage of laborers for local work. As a result, over 300 German prisoners of war trustees from the Atlanta camp near Holdridge were housed in Hastings to work in the brickyards and do farm work. Housing was soon absolutely unavailable in Hastings. Everyone was begged to provide sleeping space for war workers. Attics, basements, garages, and sheds were being rented out. Houses were being petitioned into sleeping rooms throughout the city. People often slept in shifts in these rooms. Where the high school is today, over 700 mobile homes were pulled in to accommodate the NAD workers. 840 housing units were built at Spencer Park to accommodate 4,000 workers. Today, it's Good Samaritan Village. The operational layout of the NAD is shown on this map. The headquarters area is in red. The orange area along Highway 6 is for loaded ammunition storage. The magenta areas were non-explosive warehouses. The 3 factory areas are in blue. The test firing ranges are in green, and the 35 miles of bulk explosive storage is in yellow. The NAD had over 200 miles of railroad track. 80 or more box cars of bulk explosives and components were arriving daily, and as many leaving with loaded ammunition. The box cars were moved around on the NAD by these 10 diesel switch engines. The NAD had over 300 miles of roads. Flatbed stake trucks were used to haul bulk explosives and loaded ammunition between docks at the railroad transfer depots, factories, and storage vaults. These trucks had red flags flapping on the bumper and sirens. All other vehicles had to stop and pull over when they were moving. The loaded ammunition box cars were pushed out onto the main rail lines and made up into trains. Huge coal-fired steam engines then pulled them to either coast in 2 or 3 days for loading on naval supply ships headed for the combat zones. Employees were transported on these cattle car buses, simply a semi-trailer screened in with hard benches to sit on. These buses picked up workers at 4 stops in Hastings, took them out to the main gate where they walked past a Marine guard for ID and then got on another bus which took them out to their factory area. Employees were bused to the lunch locker buildings in their factory area. The women's showers and locker area is at the far end of this building and the men's on this end. In between is the cafeteria or break area. Every worker had to get into Navy coveralls without pockets. They had to wear Navy-issued cotton underwear, caps, aprons, and steel-toed shoes. They had to take supervised showers with special soap before eating and getting back into their civilian clothes. Once in Navy-issued clothes, they punched a time clock and went several blocks through these enclosed, unheated walkways to their factory building. The workers spent 10 hours, 7 days a week in factories like this, about 2 blocks long and 60 feet wide, with huge exhaust fans constantly running. The 6 flagpole-like lightning rods are to ground any static electricity in the air. Emergency drills were conducted often, with alarms going off and everyone running outside. These women workers are pouring smokeless powder into 40-millimeter casings. Notice they are all wearing coveralls and their hair is covered. This man is manipulating major caliber projectiles over 8 inches in diameter. This man is gas checking the seal on a 16-inch battleship projectile over 5 feet long and weighing nearly 3,000 pounds. Navy projectiles over 6 inches in diameter are propelled with separate powder bags. The bags are made from pure silk, packed with explosive pellets and an ignition patch attached. They were then sealed in metal canisters to protect them from the salty air before being fired. Rocket bodies were filled with propellant before the warheads and tail fin assemblies were attached. Here the rocket motors and warheads are being prepped for assembly to the bodies before being packaged for shipping. The bomb and mine area loaded and assembled bombs, mines, depth charges, and torpedo warheads. The mines being prepared here required several hundred pounds of TNT and were very complicated in their detonating apparatus. This 5-story filling building is where the TNT was melted into a hot liquid soup to pour into the warheads. The building is especially designed for accidental explosions. The bottom 2 floors is a slanted concrete banked wall with earth. There is an escape portal and a foxhole in the front. There are slides coming down from the 3rd and 4th floor to the ground. The enclosed passageway had many rail tracks for the trolley carts to move the warheads through the filling process. The 3rd floor had 6 steam kettles that each held 1,200 pounds of TNT poured from 50-pound hat boxes. The steam valves were then opened and the temperature brought up to 200 degrees, melting the mixture into a gray soup. The hot TNT soup went down through pipes to fill warheads on the turntables below. Here a torpedo warhead is being prepared for placement on the turntable trolley cart before being filled with 700 pounds of hot melted TNT. Once the warheads were filled with hot TNT soup, they moved on trolley carts to this cooling shed, building number 108, where they were steamed off, ground wired, and cooled back into a solid for 12 hours. Then they were loaded onto boxcars. This 80 by 100 foot building was banked on all sides with slanted concrete earth embanked blast walls. On April 6, 1944, it disintegrated when over 100,000 pounds of TNT exploded. Notice the escape foxhole near the center of the picture. This is an aerial photograph of the blast site after the explosion. There was nothing left but a 15-foot hole in the ground. You can see the escape foxhole in the center of the debris. The explosion took place at 1:20 in the morning. 8 people were killed and 89 badly injured. Suddenly all the lights were out and people were being thrown into the air, screaming, bleeding, and dying in the pitch blackness. The 5 people named on this monument marker were completely vaporized in the explosion. No identifiable trace of them was found. 5 months later, at 9:15 in the morning, September 15, 1944, this transfer depot number 98 blew up when over 1 million pounds of explosives went off. This building was 500 foot long and designed to transfer explosive materials from rail cars to trucks. On each side is a 20-foot high earthen berm to direct the concussion of an accidental blast skyward. In the foreground is a foxhole to escape, if possible. The blast hole left a hole in the ground 500 foot long, 140 feet wide, and 30 foot deep. In the explosion, picture shown here, there are people and vehicles in the upper left to give some idea of the size of the explosion pit. This is an aerial photograph of the explosion site taken during the investigation. Note the blast area between the 2 long earthen berms. This is what the building looked like before the explosion. The Navy Court of Inquiry determined that a man loading depth charges into a boxcar with a 2-wheel cart dropped one down onto the tracks below. The depth bomb went off, then the boxcar, and 9 minutes later the entire building blew up. This is a snapshot photo of the explosion cloud from Clay Center 8 miles away. It was the 6th largest man-made explosion in recorded history prior to the atomic bomb. The concussion was felt in McCook and Omaha, 150 miles away. Windows were cracked in Lincoln, 100 miles away. The shock wave in the ground knocked fruit off of storm cellar shells 40 miles away. This 40 millimeter shell is 18 inches long and weighs 5 pounds. There were 33 million of these shells brought back to the NAD after the war for salvage. The powder was removed from the casing, TNT removed from the projectile, the detonator caps and primers were disposed of. These expensive machine components were then steam cleaned, soaked in solvent, and stored for the next war. This NAD activity was almost as dangerous as the initial loading process. Obsolete ammunition components were smashed, baled, and sold as scrap to manufacturing industries. The Korean War broke out in 1950, and soon the NAD was back up to 3,000 ammunition workers. Operations were nearly the same as World War II for loading, assembly, storage, and shipping. However, security wasn't nearly as critical, and employees could now drive their cars through the main gate and park out at the factory buildings. After 1950, we were engaged in a Cold War with Russia and China. The NORAD radar site was built on the NAD to monitor all enemy aircraft within range of America. Up to the 1980s, these huge B-52 bombers like this were flying over the NAD at 500 feet, practicing to be undetectable by radar. They also practiced electronic bombing, using the grain elevator at Fairfield and 2nd and Burlington in Hastings as targets. The Naval Ammunition Depot was declared obsolete in 1958. It would take 8 years to demilitarize this military facility and make it safe for a civilian environment. Over 10,000 boxcar and semi-truckloads were hauled away with ammunition components and equipment to other sites. The 65 factory buildings like this had to be cleaned of all explosive residue on surfaces and floor drains. In filling buildings like this, the only solution seemed to be loading the building with wood pallets, soaking them with fuel oil, and setting the whole thing on fire. This, of course, completely destroyed the building from any possible future use. The 1,900 storage vaults were flame sprayed and acid scrubbed to remove any explosive residue. The NAD flag was hauled down for the last time on June 30th, 1966, with a closing ceremony and a well-done tribute. The decommissioned NAD was turned over to the Government Services Administration as surplus property. None of the original farmers got their property back. The land was divided up like this. The 50 square miles in the orange area went to the U.S. Department of Agriculture for a meat animal research center. Nebraska acquired 5 square miles, the magenta area, for the National Guard. The 20 square miles in the blue area went to Clay and Adams County, which formed the Hadco Corporation for the sale, lease, and rental of buildings and grounds. The 1 square mile in red went to Central Community College, along with the brick headquarters buildings. The Meat Animal Research Center is a world-class operation with 300 employees and 30,000 head of experimental livestock over an area of 50 square miles. The Greenleaf National Guard Army Reserve Facility provides training for 20 to 40,000 soldiers per year on their 5-mile site. Central Community College took over the 1 square mile headquarters area and the brick buildings. This original NAD headquarters buildings is now a dormitory. Most of the NAD factory buildings are now manufacturing products for civilian population. Over 1,000 of these explosive vaults along Highway 6 have been used for a pork operation. Up to 90,000 heads of hogs at a time are housed in this facility. Today, America has 16 Trident nuclear submarines. These state-of-the-art warships can stay submerged undetectable for 90 days at a time. There are 24 nuclear missiles on board. These crew members from the USS Nebraska Trident nuclear submarine toured the NAD in 2004. These young men were completely fascinated with this facility that had produced ammunition for their fathers and grandfathers at a different point in time. In World War II and the Korean War, our enemies had no way to reach this location with any weapon. Today, however, given the longitude, latitude, and elevation coordinates on this NAD flagpole base, the USS Nebraska could turn the whole place to glass in moments from the middle of the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean. Today, as you drive through this once pastoral farmland, the old war factories still break the skyline as a reminder of an unbelievable time in history when this nation was completely united in a war effort against enemies that could have taken over our country.
The trauma for Hastings, Nebraska, which was the third largest city in the state in 1945, Omaha, Lincoln, and then Hastings. Hastings has not grown by one person in 70 years because of the impact of this naval ammunition depot on Hastings. Parents told their kids during the war years, don't you dare go downtown after 6 o'clock at night. And because of the trauma of all of the military activity, all of 1st Street was for black sailors. 2nd and 3rd Street was for the airmen from Harvard that came in buses from Harvard 15 miles away. And there were times that there were riots. They took trucks with sandbag gun emplacements down on 1st Street. Marines had Browning automatic rifles and machine guns and quelched riots and potential riots down there. And this went on all those years during World War II and the Korean War. So as a result, like I say, instead of the 3rd largest city in the state now, Hastings is about 10th, and they haven't grown by one person as a reaction to this naval ammunition depot. I said it took 8 years to move all of the explosives and equipment and so on to other facilities from 1958 to 1966. And they would load everything up on trucks and take it to other military bases. Here in Minden, there was a semi-truck came through in October of 1953, just 3 months after the Korean War. It blew up just 2 or 3 miles west of here near Axtell, and it was carrying 36,000 pounds of bombs. And it blew a hole in the road, 50 foot, tore out 7 sections of railroad track, and 20 miles away it was damaging buildings. The truck driver, as he drove through Minden back then, looked in his rearview mirror and his rear wheels were on fire. And so he kept on going and drove it off in the ditch, and he and the assistant driver ran. Nobody was killed, but at any rate, that's typical of moving these explosives around. There were like 80 boxcars per day coming into Hastings with empty casings and shells and so on, plus the bulk explosives, and at least 80 boxcars per day were leaving. And this facility was producing 40% of our World War II Navy ammunition. Before you leave today, be sure and take a look at those maps back there, especially the 232 farm families. Harold Warp, that started Pioneer Village over here, had a farm down there, and he lost his farm, apparently to the POW facility in Holdridge. But they processed over 100,000 German prisoners of war over here in Holdridge, just 20 miles away from you guys. There were 23 sub-camps. You could go to your county agent and you could hire these German POWs for 10 cents an hour to pick corn, to shock wheat or whatever it was you wanted done. These German POWs, 100,000 of them processed there in Holdridge. Glenn Thompson wrote a wonderful book. It's available through the Phelps County Museum over there. And at any rate, if you were a German POW, it was 1,500 miles to the nearest coast if you didn't speak the language, and then it was 3,500 miles across an ocean. So there were no real escapees from the Holdridge camp in all the years that it was open. Many of those German POWs came back, like Kimmel Orchard, and he was picking apples as a POW and came back and bought the camp. The Foban brothers had a diesel shop in Hastings. But our history of World War II in this area is just overwhelming. There were 12 airfields in Nebraska, and the people that lost their farms out here, like Harold Warp and all these people, like 232 families lost farms for the Naval Ammunition Depot, and the 12 airfields, he's lost 4 or 5 square miles of land. All they got was $58 an acre for their land. Today that land is going for $8,000 to $10,000 an acre. And the history of World War II, the Korean War, and even Vietnam is just overwhelming. The reason that this facility was shut down in '58, just a year or two before Vietnam, is so well built that it is not cost effective to tear down the buildings. If you were going to pour a new sidewalk or a new driveway at your house, it would be 6-sack concrete mix. This is all 10-sack mix, Navy specifications, and it's so tough and hard that a jackhammer just sort of dances around. So it's not cost effective to tear down any of these buildings. That's why they're still all out there. Any of you at any time can go out there, and it's got good paved roads, and you can drive around out there on a weekend or something like that and see what's going on. 90,000 head of hogs, and our governor has got several facilities out there as well. But with that, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to ask if anybody's got any questions at all that I might be able to answer.
How many people worked out there? Do we have anybody that worked out there?
My mother did.
This man just handed me a pair of pliers. Everything in all those 65 factories had to be spark-proof. Copper, aluminum, and so on. This is beryllium. This is a beryllium tool, kind of a greenish-looking metal. And all the employees out there, of which there were 11,000 employees in the peak years, whenever they were involved in any of the assembly of these things, they had to use these beryllium tools for all of this stuff.
How'd you get that, Mr. Brewer?
I bought it at an auction somewhere around Minden.
really-
Another bit of trivia, I had a former student that had a grandparent was one of those that they never found any, it just,
Yeah.
like,
They have a good monument marker out there, and they have the names of those people that are on there. And for 2 weeks, they looked for any body part identifiable. There was absolutely nothing. There was nothing identifiable after that one explosion.
Go ahead. Here's a question back here, Walt.
I was told that the dirt that covered all the mounds was brought up from Texas.
Yes.
Tell me a little about that.
Okay. The dirt on top of the concrete bunkers is 2 foot deep. It comes from down in Texas, and it's called califachi. And it's very, very good as far as holding moisture and feeding grass roots and so on. And so they brought that dirt up here from Texas and put it on 2 foot of it on top of all of the explosive bunkers. And here in Nebraska, as you know, we have clay and sand. All that dirt would have been gone in 1 year. But as a result, it's been there for 75 years, so it was worth the effort to bring this califachi up from Texas and put it on top of these bunkers. And it's still there today growing grass. That's not for camouflage. If you stopped and thought about it, at sundown when the sun's going down, the shadow that each one of those was throwing would have been a perfect target. So being here in the Midwest like this, there was just nothing that any country in World War II had that could reach this facility.
I'm from Texas. What part of Texas did that dirt come from?
Somewhere I've seen the name of the town, but at any rate, it's from down there in Texas. That's all I know.
Okay.
And it's called califachi. That's where the
Yeah.
engineers talk about it.
Thank you.
I think I had an aunt that worked out there. But okay, you know, we talk about the Vietnam War and all those stuff, all that stuff in the air. So the women that worked out there and they had to take showers and all that stuff, so did any of them later in life come down with cancer or whatever because of being out there and all those
The Navy used what was called ammonium picrate for their big shells on board ships. And ammonium picrate is a yellow-looking stuff. And it's as fine as flour that you use in a kitchen. And for people that were out there working with it, breathing it in, it turned their hair yellow, their eyeballs and their skin yellow, and people catching a bus in downtown Hastings, there they were with orange, yellow hair and eyeballs and so on. But I don't think I've ever heard of any medical issues that came from that.
Later on in life.
Later on in life. But there may have been other things that caused that, but at least what they loaded into the Navy shells, the ammonium picrate called Yellow D, didn't seem to bother anybody. But the people hated the look, and they didn't want to do that. And of course, the women, they had to get into these coveralls and keep their hair covered at all times, and they had to wear Navy underwear, cotton underwear, and instead of nylon, because it might cause a spark, and they couldn't comb their hair. And they just hated these Navy clothes and everything about that. But everybody had to dress the same. And before every meal and before changing back into their civilian clothes, there was a Navy nurse there that had to do a body check while they were taking their showers and so on before they were allowed to eat or change clothes.
Wow. So 75 cents an hour.
74 cents an hour, that was 3 times the amount that was being paid if you could even find a job, which was 25 cents an hour in 1940.
No. Do you have a question?
Little bit of trivia. It took 2.5 minutes for that sound. Once that bomb went off, 2.5 minutes for it to get to Minden.
Okay.
Later, when we heard it here. I didn't hear it, but some people I've talked to did.
The big explosion was felt in Omaha, 150 miles away, and McCook.
Which would be 5 minutes or 10 minutes?
Yeah, right. And there were people that were out farming with horses. This one man told me, he says, I was standing there in bib overalls, and he says, all of a sudden, he says, my pants were flapping in the concussion, and he was over 40 miles away from there. And 40 miles away, it was like an earthquake in the ground, and the shock wave as such was knocking fruit off of farm storm cellar shells, canned tomatoes and peaches and what have you.
Was the aggregate or the all come from northern?
Norman, Nebraska over here had most of the sand pits, but it cleared down to Superior, wherever they could find a sand pit, and they had 6 concrete cement plants out there. And back then they didn't have ready-mix trucks, they were side loaders, but they were pouring 8 of those vaults per day. And again, they had to build a circus tent over each one of them in the middle of the winter with what they call salamanders or coal-fired heaters, and keep the temperature at 40 degrees. And a lot of those workers back then were southern workers that had never worn shoes before, so they're out here in the middle of the winter in Nebraska, you know, pouring these concrete bunkers.
Jack?
Newark, Nebraska, which is north there, had a lot of sand and gravel that went over to Hastings. Is anybody here of the Keith Matheson family?
Right, that was the former
Keith
student right
Matheson,
there.
yeah.
She's our piano
I
teacher.
had a former student, that's the one right there.
Keith Matheson, what comes to my mind is he was a forklift operator in the 180 building, and they didn't find a trace of him. And I have talked to some of his family members and so on since then. And what was the name of the lady that was?
Judy. Judy is the daughter.
Okay.
Judy Kimball.
Judy Kimball.
There were 3 children, Gary,
Yeah.
Dave, and Judy.
Yeah,
Yes.
Dave and Judy were twins.
And I'm not sure if they were born yet.
They-
but Gary-
No, they weren't.
They weren't.
Dave and Judy were born there.
I think one of the boys was born.
Yeah, Gary, the oldest.
Gary,
Oldest
yes.
one.
Gary. I think I've talked to him.
I wouldn't doubt that.
And they lived in a little house up by the high school.
They were in my class.
Did he have anything to say to you after all this happened? And his father
No.
passed away?
No.
Like I say, he was a forklift
Not about
operator
that.
in that
Okay.
building.
Brickyard Park?
Brickyard Park has been around since the 1880s. And they furnished nearly all of the paving brick in Nebraska until the 1940s. And during the war, they used a lot of these German POWs out there in that Brickyard Park and making brick for, and the Naval Ammunition Depot, their brick buildings used 4.5 million bricks from the Brickyard Park. And you go out there and look at these buildings after 75 years, there's not a crack in that brick anyplace. It's just fabulous brick.
So now, did you make the comment that you could drive through there and
Oh yeah, there's
Oh, yeah.
paved roads and without any, that lead from Highway 6 through the community college and even south and so on. And you can go out there anytime on any day of the week because the roads are simply open.
because it used to be everything was barbed wire fenced off and you had to cross
Well,
that to
there were
get in.
65 factory buildings in 3 different areas.
Okay,
And those had chain link fences running around them and you couldn't get in there. Now they're completely wide open. So you can drive through there and you can see the names of the countries, companies like T&L Irrigation, a world-class manufacturer. And if you went over to Egypt and looked down from an airplane, you'd see it's about 20 miles on either side of the Nile River. It's just as green as it is here in Nebraska. That's because these pivot irrigation systems are able to go down and pull that up. And so you have T&L Irrigation is just one of the many manufacturers that's out there.
Bus tours, my wife and I, this last year tried to get in on one of the bus tours. It was already full.
Oh, yeah. Mine is, I've done bus tours for nearly 20 years. It takes about 2 hours. We generally leave from the Hastings Museum parking lot, but I don't do the bus tours for the Hastings Historical Museum, but rather for Clay County. Clay County lost nearly 70 square miles to the Naval Ammunition Depot, and the city of Hastings, or the county of Adams, only lost 6 miles. Well, it put Clay County in such dire straits because of losing all the tax base that they almost had to merge with another county. And so the history of the Naval Ammunition Depot is very, very important to Clay County.
any other questions? This is good, we learn a lot from questions. Everybody remembers the place. And when you went down Highway 6 before the interstate, you remembered all the hills when you were a kid?
Yeah.
You thought that was so neat when you went by? I mean, I'm so young, I know. But,
It's all still there.
yeah. Did any of those humps, or whatever you want to call them, blow up?
They tried blowing up some of those over near Clay Center. They tried blowing up the black powder vaults, and all that happened was the ground shook, the steel doors flew off, and nothing happened to the concrete buildings. They said that really the only thing you could possibly do is dig a gigantic hole beside each one of them and just roll it in there and put the dirt over the top. And the Meat Animal Research Center, there's over 700 of those vaults on that land, and you can't really run a pivot irrigation system on them or anything like that. So that's why the Roman L. Haruska Meat Animal Research Center took all that over.
Sure. Makes sense.
Anybody else have a contribution?
My husband's grandfather lost their farm.
By all means, take a look at the 3 pictures on the wall over there, and the one over there on the farthest left is a 1938 map showing the names of all the land farmers and so on, and some of these people, they were all notified by the U.S. Department of Defense and the War Powers Act and the right of eminent domain, and some of them had only 2 weeks to leave, and they received an average price of $58 an acre. And others had up to 6 months, depending on the type of building that was going to be built there. But at any rate, that's a record of all of the farm families that lost their farms. When I've done this presentation anywhere in Clay and Adams County, people really flock to that and look for their relatives that lost their farms.
I just have one quick comment. I first became acquainted with that when I was 7 or 8 years old. I had an uncle that lived in Harvard. My parents would drive us past there. My brother and I, of course, wanted to know why they just all those big humps out there. Anyway, my dad said, get used to it. It's going to look just like that on the day you die.
Yeah, right. Absolutely right. No, there's very little, and today there's areas out there that insurance companies will not touch. They don't want anybody going into some of those buildings that are out there yet because they set them on fire after 1958, and it took all of the temper out of the reinforcing steel in the concrete, so it's not even safe to walk into those buildings. And yet nobody's responsible for that nowadays in the factory buildings. The bomb and mine area, just as an example, 2 months or 3 months before we dropped the atomic bomb on Japan, we had mined all of the harbors around all of the islands of Japan so not a single ship could go in or out. It took 12,000 of these mines to do this, those that were on the bottom, those that were on the on cables, and then those that were floating on the surface. And I'm going to say that probably all 12,000 of those bombs were made right here at this facility. And this was just a couple, 3 months before the atomic bomb was dropped. Yes?
Is this the only facility like this in the United States?
No, McAllister, Oklahoma is still open today, and Hawthorne, Nevada, and Crane, Indiana. So those are also naval facilities, and then there were smaller camps that did just nothing but rockets or something like that. But the three big ones were Crane, Indiana for the Pacific or Atlantic Fleet, Hawthorne, Nevada for the Pacific Fleet, and notice that they're 300 miles inland so that they can't be attacked from the sea. And but McAllister, Oklahoma is still open today, and it's making munitions for every branch of the service down there in McAllister.
There's another arm.
Yes?
So you said like no one's responsible for those old factory buildings?
Here's the Hadco Corporation took over 20 square miles that had mostly the factories in it. Hadco is an acronym for Hastings, Adams, and Clay County. And it was a corporation, and it took the 65 factories and got it back into civilian hands and that kind of stuff. And today they rent that railroad track for those rail cars that are being repaired for $17 a day. And this facility that's out there right now, through the Hadco Corporation, if you got a building or something like that, most of them went back into the farmland. If you have one of those factory buildings sitting there, again, an insurance company will not insure that. And so as a result, if you had a farm with one of those sitting on there, you would simply close that off as best you can and keep people from trespassing in there to protect you from the insurance problems. And of course, the other thing is the cost effectiveness of trying to tear one of those buildings down and clean it up is overwhelming. And so it is just a state of limbo right now. Yeah. Yes?
Well, there was the ammunition, plant at Grand Island. What was the difference between the two areas?
Grand Island was an Army plant that made artillery shells and bombs. And it was open till 2001. And the Army and the Navy never see eye to eye on anything, never. And as a result, here in Nebraska, you've got Sidney, Grand Island, and Meade are Army ammunition plants. And this one here is a Navy ammunition plant. And this one was placed here because it's right in the middle of the country between the two coasts and the Gulf of Mexico.
Does Grand Island have the big bunker things then too?
Grand Island's had a few bunkers, but most of the time they sent it out to Sydney. Instead of having 1,900 of these vaults there, most of their storage was out there at Sydney, Nebraska, and just enough for, we'll say, a month's activities in Grand Island. But they were open in Grand Island until 2001. About a third of the size, 25 square miles.
Anybody else? Oh, go ahead, go ahead.
This facility is one of the top 10 in the nation. We're a total of 9,000 military operations in America in World War II, and 3,000 are still being cleaned up, and this facility in Hastings is one of the top 10. There are 6 Superfund areas out there where the contaminants are leaching down into the water table and are still contaminated to this day. I went to a Corps of Engineers meeting. They said it'll be another 30 years before they get it cleaned up.
Get this site cleaned up?
This one? No, they said it'll be another 30 years before they can clean it and get it cleaned up.
This one?
Yeah.
Ah.
What's that doing to our groundwater?
Yeah. And it's some of the best farmland in the world.
Yeah.
Dead flat. It's got 6 inches of black dirt that blew in, and the water table's down about 100 feet, and some of the finest farmland in the world, and it's just not accessible.
And they're not gonna put, hurry up?
No, the Meat Animal Research Center is perfectly content to have 30,000 head of livestock and government cowboys on horseback. And that's the way things stand today.
Is there information on the bus tours?
You can phone the Clay County Historical Society and Clay Center. That's the ones that I do.
Okay.
And then Hastings has a combined bus tour that they do of the city of Hastings, Adams County, and the Naval Ammunition Depot. So just phone the Hastings Museum or else the Clay County Historical Society.
Anybody else? Well, do you have a question back there?
If you don't already know more about the NAD than you want to, I've got these books that are $26.70 with the tax, and the DVD, which is about twice as long as the one you saw, for $17, and they'll be available afterwards if you're interested.
What's nice about those is after you've listened to the tape and listened to him talk, how many things do you remember? And you can always go back through a book and a little bit of advertisement here. And we do want to thank, Carolyn, there you are, and there he is. Dave, for always letting us use their facility, rent their facility, whatever, because this is just a nice place to have it. We used to try to have it at different places. This is perfect. And don't forget the things at Fort Kearney that Grant shared with us. Thank you so much for having you come here and tell us all this stuff.
You betcha.
Wasn't there
My
one
pleasure.
question on that?